Okay, here we are. We're going to get started right away. If there's anybody that wants to enter for the door prize, we'll do that at the end of the evening after the questions are done. And help yourself to snacks and beverages here. And I'll be turning things over to Harvey to do the introduction right away here.
Is my mic working? Yep. I'll speak at it. Hello, hello. Testing, whatever that means. Anyway, my wife, she's got a big gong and a hook, and if I go too long on the introduction, I get it. So anyway, I'm trying not to be too long, but there's so many things I could say about a wonderful guest tonight, Wes and Johane. Known them 30, 35 years, and they've done some marvelous things, particularly with bison. But I want to first of all welcome you all here, and particularly welcome Wes and Johane. I'm here sort of as a co-sponsor of the event. I'm one of the chairs of the Crooked Creek Conservancy, and so we used to combine quite often with science outreach to support these events, and we're sort of back in that now, and we appreciate that science outreach has accepted that and allowed me to do this introduction of my friends Wes and Johane. I've known Wes and Johane for probably 30 years, and I guess the first time I set eyes on him, I didn't really know him. Somehow or other, got an invitation to come there in January or December. They used to have a roundup where they would round up the ones that they thought were excess, and they would be shipping them somewhere to somewhere in Canada or Siberia or Alaska or someplace by truck or by plane. And what a wonderful experience that was. It was, you know, you think of bison, you think of how rough and so on. It was such a quiet, gentle thing. Of course, they have these massive chutes, and it was no injuries. And I was so impressed with that time. I thought this is a very humane way of handling bison, and I appreciate that. Wes has been in the wildlife tech and if you will, business raising bisons for many years. And he also, before that, he was working in the Yukon with caribou as well. So he has a history of working with the various ungulates. And his partner, Johane Janelle, who I've known a little longer because I used to know her when she worked at the Trouble Kids place there right near Elk Island Park. And I used to have students that worked with what they call wilderness therapy, working with young people, adventure therapy, and so on. And that's why I first heard about Johane, and then I met her again with Wes. And she, of course, Wes is not only a great writer, and he knows from research and from his own individual indigenous knowledge and so on, he knows much about this species. But Johane comes at it from a sort of a photographic point of view. She's a marvelous photographer, and as you'll see, both here, some of them will be artwork from Wes, and some of it will be a lot of the very good pictures will be from Johane. And while I'm at it, I'm sort of unofficially the book salesman here tonight. You'll see this book over there. This is the most marvelous book. It's only $40, and this tells the whole story and all the relationships of this marvelous species, this keystone species that used to roam this one and the plains and the wood bison all the way from Alaska right through to northern Mexico. And this book sort of lays out all the many relationships, ecological and otherwise, that so anything you ever wanted to know about this kind of a species, it's in that book, and I recommend it very highly. I'm getting the look here, a little bit of a look from my wife. So I guess what I wanted to say, that this book is highly regarded by many people, including Leroy Little Bear, who's an elder and a chief, one of the chief traditional knowledge holders with the Kainai, with the Blackfoot. He says it's a book that everybody should have on their bookshelf, and there are many other people that recommend the book. So I hope that you'll only get a fraction of what Wes and Johane have learned over the last 45 years about bison. But this book has a whole lot more. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll stop flogging your book, and here is Wes. Wes Olson.
Thank you, Harvey. Well, that was a real treat. Thank you. My head's a little bit big. I might have to get a new hat now. So yeah, it's a real treat for us to be here and see some familiar faces in the audience. So thanks for coming out. Could somebody dim the lights? Doesn't have to be too dark, just to. Yeah, that's good. So I'll dive right into it. The talk is called Bison as a Keystone Species. Since I'm speaking at a university, probably everybody knows what a keystone species is. But just for those who might not, a keystone species is an animal or a plant perhaps that has an inordinate amount of impact on the landscapes that they live in. So this talk, there's a keystone. The keystone is a term derived from stone architecture. If you see a stone arch, it's the center stone at the top, wedge-shaped. And if you take that stone out, the entire structure will collapse. It's the same with species. And see if I can, here we go. Joanne's over there in a purple jacket. Without her photography, I'd just be a handsome dude standing up here muttering at you. So all the photographs in here are hers. So we'll talk about the historical distribution of bison, where they lived, both plains and wood bison. This is a young bull crossing the Lamar River Valley in Yellowstone. We'll talk about how they affect the ecosystems that they live in, who they shared that landscape with, oops, and some examples of the species that were influenced either directly or indirectly by bison on the landscape. So this is a map that was put together by Joel Allen in 1876, and the different colors represent time change and the contraction of the historic plains bison population from 1800 right through until the late 1800s. 1885, when the last free-ranging wild plains bison in North America, 23 animals were hiding in the upper headwaters of the Pelican River Valley in Yellowstone. 23 animals over a species that once perhaps was 30 million was quite a reduction over a short time frame. At the same time, around 1900, there was another 250 wood bison that had survived to slaughter up there. They were never as numerous. Population estimates typically around 165 to 170,000. But they also suffered from the bison genocide of the 1800s. This is a very complicated map that you don't need to pay much attention to, other than these folks identified 116 ecoregions in North America. I went through the massive book, it's almost as big as ours, and went through it and identified all the ecoregions that bison once lived in, and there's 46 of them. Some examples of those ecoregions: Wood Buffalo National Park, a couple of young bulls that are just near the Salt Plains, the northern part of the park. This is a classic example of a wood bison bull in the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary, taken by my friend Chuck Blythe. You don't see many of these guys around anymore. Went down to Antelope Island State Park, very dry, arid landscape. Just across the lake, this is Great Salt Lake in the background, and off to the right of the screen, there's a cave system called Promontory Butte. Archaeologists from the University of Alberta have spent a lot of time there trying to understand how Indigenous people lived on that landscape, and did they hunt bison? How do they survive on that landscape? In the back of that cave, it's lived in for over 6,000 years by Indigenous people. They found a garbage pile, and it was all the soles of the moccasins that they'd worn out. The moccasin style was such that the uppers were intact for many years, but the soles would wear out. So they'd put a new sole on it and carry on. It turns out the moccasin style that they found in the back of that cave is identical to the moccasins of the Dene people in northern Canada. So it's Dene people that gave rise to the Apache and Navajo peoples in that part of the country. I thought that was quite fascinating. Caprock Canyon State Park in the Panhandle of Texas. This was the last population of wild ones in that part of the country. A guy named Charles Goodnight and his wife Mary captured and saved the last animals in that population. They're the smallest bison in all of North America, probably due to the hot climate that they live in. They made it over into the oak savannas of Florida. This is Paynes Prairie State Park. Prehistoric bison went right down to the southern tip of the Florida Panhandle. The tallgrass prairie, it's still a remnant patch of tallgrass prairie in southern Manitoba, and this is in Oklahoma. A lot of people are, they're amazed that there were once 30 million bison in North America, but they don't realize at the same time there's 36 million elk and 32 million pronghorn. So it was a densely populated landscape. This is in South Dakota. It's actually a private ranch. They have 3,500 head in that one group. I couldn't get it all in one frame. It's in the Black Hills. This is the southern part of the mountain populations in Grand Tetons National Park, just south of Yellowstone. And here in the Aspen Parkland, this is Prince Albert, but could be Elk Island for the similarities that are there. But the bulk of the talk is going to focus on the northern mixed grass prairie in what's now Grasslands National Park that sits right on the Montana-Saskatchewan border. My wife and I transferred from Elk Island, where I was the park warden, to Grasslands after I took a herd of bison there in 2005. We had the opportunity to go down and learn that landscape with the bison. So for those who haven't, has anybody been to Grasslands National Park? 1, 2. Well, the shame on the rest of you. This little circle here is the Cypress Hills, and the Frenchman River drains southeasterly from there, crosses the Montana border. The white line is it joins the Missouri and then later on Mississippi. This is the northern mixed grass prairie, part of the Great Plains of North America, and that's where the bulk of the talk is going to focus. I went too fast. It's a pretty neat landscape. This is the only place in North America where the Cordilleran ice sheets, the Laurentide ice sheets, collided and met with the Cordilleran ones that came from the Rockies. They met, that's the Frenchman River, and behind these buttes, the continental ice sheet covered that landscape on the north, and then the Cordilleran one that came from the Rockies melted on the south side of the river. When the Cordilleran ice sheet melted, it just dropped straight down, left behind this complex knob and kettle topography. But the continental ice sheet melted and retreated northwards, leaving behind many, many miles long linear meltwater channels that go north from the Frenchman. So an incredibly diverse landscape, which made it hugely popular for both bison and for indigenous people. There's buttes like this one in the foreground where there's up to 200 teepee rings setting up on top of there. It's almost like you hear of Masada in Israel. So incredibly rich. For both people and for bison. For those who haven't been there, Grasslands National Park is split into 2 blocks, a west and an east block. In the west block, it's 75 square miles where the bison have access to it. And there's over 28,000 archaeological sites just in that one block. So a long, long history of indigenous hunting on this landscape. How do bison affect the ecosystems? Well, here's a pair of brown-headed cowbirds warming their feet on the young bull. They do it in 3 principal ways. The first is through physical disturbance on the landscape. And this is a fairly significant one. I mean, he's having the piddle, so that's a pretty direct impact. But, lots of nutrients in that as well. The bison trails that they put on the landscape during the winter months were huge importance for every species out there. When Grasslands National Park was first began to be formed in 1987, it was through the purchase of ranchers' lands who wanted to retire. And the parks policy at that time was, as soon as the rancher signed the sales agreement, Parks went in there and evicted all the cattle, took down all the fences, all the remnant buildings, the ranch headquarters, all had to go. And created a lot of animosity with the local communities in doing that. But it meant that from 1987 through to the arrival of the bison in 2005, there wasn't a large mammal like bison or cattle that could punch a trail through those deep wind-driven snowdrifts, which meant then that species like the pronghorn antelope couldn't navigate that landscape anymore. So they stopped. Pronghorn antelope have the longest migration of any North American mammal, 800 kilometers south into the US from here every year, and that got stopped. So bringing the bison back now, they punch those trails, and those smaller deer and antelope can continue to stay there. Bison manure is obviously a fairly significant one. On average, a bison will drop about 10 to 12 of these per day. This one was speckled with the droppings of a robin who sat up there and used it as a listening post in her hunt. Bison wallows, of course, are a pretty significant one. They're one of my favorite things to visit when we're in a bison sanctuary somewhere. We'll talk a lot more about them. Patch grazing is one of the major reasons for the establishment of new bison populations, because bison graze the landscape differently, much differently than cattle do, and it's referred to as patch grazing. And then pugging. Pugging is simply a fancy word for a footprint driven deep into the soil, but it's so significant that the Russian government hosted a program of establishing Pleistocene National Park in northern Siberia. A fellow named Sergei Zimov came up with this brainwave that if you put large numbers of hoofed mammals like bison back on that landscape, that frozen permafrost tundra type environment, the seed bank that's in the soil from the end of the Pleistocene 12,000 years ago is still there and it's still viable. And it's the scarification action of footprints like that that causes those seeds to germinate and regrow. And it can switch from a permafrost northern type environment into a dry steppe grassland like Grasslands National Park. So Russia got 4 loads of 30 bison from Elk Island National Park, wood bison, and they're now probably about 200 animals in the nursery herd. It's a baby factory, and they take them north into Pleistocene National Park. And they've proven it. They're converting that landscape from a permafrost environment into a dry steppe grassland just because of the footprints and that scarification action. That's what this is cattle trails, because I can't find an aerial shot of bison trail, but that's what it would have looked like historically. Horning of trees and shrubs is a pretty significant one, and combined with the cessation of First Nations burning in the spring, it caused the aspen parkland to expand both westwards and southwards from its historic range. Major impacts when you put bison back on the landscape. They can denude some aspen parklands pretty quickly. And direct relationships, wolves and bison and wood buffalo have never been disconnected from each other. They've always interacted. Bison first entered North America about 160,000 years ago, and wolves were here before them. And of course, where you have bison and wolves, you've also got ravens. We were in Yellowstone a few years back and came across this boar grizzly who had killed that bison cow. He feasted on her for a day and buried her under a heap of debris. We came back the next day and a sow grizzly with 3 yearling cubs was on it. And by the end of the day, there was nothing there but a skeleton. And of course, when you have bison on the landscape like that, you've got bison skeletons. On bison, most natural populations will have an annual mortality rate from natural causes of across 3 to 5%. So imagine 30 million bison dying out there, or 5% of 30 million. That's a lot of carcasses on the landscape. And the nutritional pulse into the ecosystem from one bison carcass is tremendous. This is a bison bull that had been killed by another bull during the breeding season on Elk Island. They put a trail camera on it and counted 18 different coyotes that foraged on that carcass during its time on the ground. And when a bison dies like this and is unmolested by people, one of the first species to arrive is flies. Then it's en masse. Tens of thousands of flies will lay their eggs on that carcass. And because all of the eggs are laid at the same time, as they mature, they leave that carcass at the same time. And there's this massive wave of maggots leaving the carcass and moving into the underbrush, which then provides a huge boost to the local insectivore populations. That's birds or small mammals or amphibians or reptiles. Pretty significant. And where you have coyotes, of course, you've got coyote poop. And it's a pretty important thing for these comma butterflies, satyr commas, pardon me. So the long consequences, long change of ecosystem consequences when you have bison on the landscape. The sexton beetle, named after the sexton of the church, whose responsibility is burying the dead. This guy will, I've always envisioned a carcass, whether it's a mouse or a bison, giving off this inorganic column of gases that rise up off of it. These guys can see that, like we can see a campfire smoke, from a long ways away. They'll fly to it, land on it, take a chunk of meat, bury it with their eggs, and then fly off to the next carcass. They can bury a whole mouse in a matter of minutes, and there's literally thousands of these on a bison carcass. He's carrying a load of phoretic mites, so little wee tiny insects on his shoulder. They're about the size, a little bit bigger than the size of a big pin, so they can't get from carcass to carcass on their own. So they hitchhike a ride on the sexton beetle, and then as he leaves, they hop on again and off to go to the next carcass and do their reproductive cycle there. So some of the indirect relationships, this is a biggie, the facilitative grazing. It just simply means that bison create a landscape that facilitates the survival of other species, other herbivores in particular. They can be white-tailed deer. This is a Nuttall's cottontail. Has anybody had a chance to see a Nuttall's cottontail? It's also called a mountain cottontail. Little wee tiny gaffer, cute as a button. They really depend upon landscapes that have been modified by bison. Mule deer, pronghorns, black-tailed prairie dogs we'll talk about more, white-tailed jackrabbits. All of these species benefit greatly by having bison back on the landscape. Some of the broader food web relationships. In Grasslands National Park back in the early 80s, they did a survey and counted 77 different grasshopper species just within the confines of the park. And for species that rely on insects as their food base, this was huge. You get that kind of diversity there. Microteens like this western jumping mouse, red fox, swift fox, and coyotes, of course, are huge insect eaters. Grasslands tried to reestablish the swift fox in the middle on several different occasions, and it always failed. Because the park had been ungrazed for so long when they reintroduced them, the grasses were very tall, and swift fox need a short grass environment to survive. So they immediately move out of the park and onto local ranch lands where the grasses were cropped shorter. So they're still in the area, just not in the park. Red squirrel nests. Back in the, we translocated a herd of wood bison from Elk Island into southern Yukon years ago, and one old bull died, and they went out to have a peek at him, and they found 5 squirrel nests scattered around in a circle around that one carcass, and the squirrels had gone there and stripped all his hair off and built their nests out of bison hair. Really quite neat. Another example of a footprint. This is a footprint driven deep into the, it's called a bentonite clay, if anybody's had the misadventure to drive on bentonite clay. Nasty stuff. Bison footprint in there, and then a horned lark came along. She plucked the shed bison hair off the landscape and wove her nest in that footprint, laid 3 of her eggs in there, and then a brown-headed cowbird came along, parasitized it with 2 of her eggs. And so you got a complete ecosystem functioning just in that one footprint. And then shed hair we'll talk a lot more about. So it's all because of the way bison graze the landscape and create that facilitative system for these other species. This is what grasslands look like today. I brought 71 animals there in the fall of 2005. There's 30 male and 30 female calves and 11 female yearlings. They were held in confinement in a holding system until May long weekend of 2006, and then they were released. And 3 times now the population has peaked at over 400, and every 2 years the park goes in and removes surplus animals. Most of them go to First Nations. It's always the priority. And if there's not enough homes for them there, then some of them will be auctioned. But that's a pretty classic scene now in grasslands. So they share the landscape with 26 different species of birds that are considered endemic grassland birds. This is the horned lark that I mentioned. 9 of these can only be found on diverse grasslands like this. And they're considered to be obligate grassland birds. You won't find them anywhere else but on a grassland system. And these are them. Oops. Where'd they go? There we go. So every one of these species is in a massive state of population decline across the Great Plains. Every single one of them since the 1970s. You look at a grassland songbird graph and it's just down and down and down. They've been doing studies inside and outside the park now since the bison have been there. And in the park, all of these species are beginning to increase in abundance. So that's a good news story. There's 35 mammal species in the park. These are the black-tailed prairie dogs. I keep clicking too fast here. About a dozen of those are obligate species. Here's some of them. Grasshopper mouse is unique in the mouse world in that he doesn't eat vegetative matter like seeds and grasses. He's strictly a predator of grasshoppers and other insects. And they have this unique ability on a full moon night to sit up on their hind legs and howl at the full moon. You can hear this really high-pitched howling sound coming out of the grasses. Really quite neat. Black-footed ferrets. Black-footed ferrets were listed as an extinct species in Canada in the 1960s. Then in a place called Meeteetse, Wyoming, a farm dog brought one home to his owner, spat it out at his owner's foot and said, "Look what I brought." And the guy had no idea what it was. He'd never seen anything like this. So he took it to a local vet who thought it might be a ferret, took it to a museum, and sure enough, it was a ferret. So they tracked down the black-tailed prairie dog colony where this animal came from, and they counted, I think, over 200 of them on that colony alone. So they were faced with a decision to make. It was an extinct species that suddenly had been rediscovered. Did they go in there and live capture them all, or just let nature take its course and hope for the best? They went in there and they captured a bunch of them and took them to a central captive breeding program to make babies. Every one of them died, 100% mortality. So they went back in, changed their protocols for care of the animals afterwards, and took them to the Metro Toronto Zoo where they set up a captive breeding program. And now I think there's well over 2,000 ferrets back on prairie dog towns in North America. We tried to introduce them back into grasslands. I think we brought 77 animals there over 3 different reintroductions, 100% mortality, not one lived. Some of that was predation from hawks and owls, some was roadkill. But through investigating a bit deeper, they found that the fleas that live on the prairie dogs carry a disease called sylvatic plague, and it's uniformly fatal to ferrets. Turns out sylvatic plague is exactly the same disease in humans. It's called bubonic plague, wiped out Europe 3 different times. So they've gone into a pretty significant program to try to eradicate the fleas that live in the burrow systems of the prairie dogs. They put a white chemical on the ground, and the ferrets or the prairie dogs going in and out of their natal dens take that, it's called deltamethrin, down into the nesting cavities to kill the fleas that live in the nesting chambers. And they've done treatment programs on one side and untreated on the other, and pretty much have eradicated the disease in the treated parts. So over time, they're hoping that to expand that and then bring the ferret back again in the hopes that they'll survive. We'll talk more about the significance of the pocket gopher coming up. I tried to get Johane to go closer to take a better picture, but she put up a little resistance and said, "No, not doing that." This is, of course, a rattlesnake. These guys are really fascinating. There's a prairie or a hibernaculum in the park that hosted, we have 5 different species of snakes there. And during the fall, when they're returning to the snake den, upwards of probably 200 to 300 snakes would all go underground together into that one pit. They had it was on a side slope, a place where the slope had slumped and created a big crack. Well, that whole thing slumped a couple of years later and buried most of those snakes, and so they couldn't emerge again. They're coming back, but it's still well down from their historic high. But I bring the snake into the topic because, jumping ahead of myself, we'll get to that one. Here's some of the obligate grassland snakes and amphibians and reptiles. Bottom center is the yellow-bellied racer, a very endangered snake in Canada. Nobody knows yet whether they produce live young or whether they reproduce with eggs, because we think that they're nesting underground in the tunnels of northern pocket gopher burrows. Greater shorthorn lizard is a rare animal in Canada. It's at the very northern extreme of its historic range. They're no bigger than the end of my thumb. And the only way you can census them on the landscape is to walk along with a stick, tapping the ground in an arc as you walk to force them to kind of squirt and move out of the way And as you can see the motion, then you can count them and see them again. Tiny little wee guys. Great Plains toad and spade-footed toads are two of the most important ones there. And we'll get into them in a bit further. The parent Plains garter snake, this is right above one of their hibernacula. In the spring, they'll emerge from, in this case, it was an old badger burrow surrounded by maybe 3 or 4 foot tall willows and shrubs. And the snakes would emerge from the den and climb up into the very topmost branches to catch the first morning sun to warm up so that they could go off and hunt for the day. So how do they do all this magic? Who do they influence? Here's a young bull having a wallow. They do it by increasing the diversity of the grassland community. There's a pair of brown-headed cowbirds hunting insects. There's a really neat series of photographs published in a wildlife magazine a few years ago. A photographer in Antelope Island State Park caught a series of photographs of the brown-headed cowbirds flying up and drinking the mucus, the snot that was dripping out of the bison's nose, because that's the only form of moisture they can get. But that mucus is incredibly rich in microbes, which provide a huge amount of protein to the birds as well. It's a neat relationship there. All of that, everything we've talked about so far leads to enhanced wildlife. Here's a nice group of pronghorns. But how does this happen? And I just mentioned it, buffalo snot. We were in a bar in South Dakota and came into the place, and they had buffalo snot on top. And boy, was that good beer, nice dark beer. I gave this talk once at the Banff Center at a big gala event, lunchtime keynote speaker. Ladies there in their finery, and I'm talking about buffalo snot. There was some, I don't know what you would call it, disgust perhaps on some places, but it's what drives the entire ecosystem. As bison are grazing across the landscape, cattle do the same thing. Their noses are constantly embedded in the vegetation as they're grazing. And every time they take a breath, and they have the largest lung capacity of any North American mammal, they're sucking in a huge quantity of air. And that air is laden with all the microbes that are sitting on the vegetation and down on the soil surface. So periodically, all that stuff gets hung up in their nasal vestibules, builds up in there. And periodically, they have to lift their heads and give a quick flick to each nostril, clean it out, and then go back to grazing again. When they clean it out, they're also ingesting, swallowing all those microbes that they picked up, the bacteria, fungi, and microbes, billions of them over the course of a day of grazing. And all of that goes down into the stomach, into the first. Bison, like cattle, have 4 stomachs, the first of which is the rumen. And millions of these things go into the rumen on a daily basis. So this is sort of a schematic of how a rumen works. I had the opportunity last winter to tear apart the rumen of an old wood bison bull that had died, and with a 5-gallon pail, I measured 47 gallons of vegetative matter just from his rumen. A large volume of stuff in there. The fungi arrive, they break down the starch so the bacteria can digest it. And then the bacteria come along and they break down the sugars, protein, and the fiber. And then these two are hunted by a protozoa. So you've got a completely functioning predator-prey relationship functioning within the rumen. These guys hunt the bacteria and the fungi. And all of that system is designed to break down the coarse cellulose that's at the food is made out of. Without them, these guys couldn't survive out there. So this is a protozoa. There's millions of these in the rumen of a bison, and each one of these guys will have millions of bacteria in them. They're the equivalent of a blue whale swimming through the ocean hunting krill, that scale of magnitude. And of course, what goes in must come out, and it comes out in a very photogenic buffalo patty. And all the bacteria that survive digestion arrive with it. So this thing is loaded with bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. And they're immediately hunted by a whole suite of insects. The fungi and bacteria that arrive with it are then preyed upon by all these dung beetles and mixed diet flies. And then they're preyed upon by the predators that arrive. One dung pat has been documented to be able to host up to 100 insect species over the course of its lifetime on the ground. And up to 1,000 individual insects can make their living off of one dung pat. Tremendous biological resource. This is an example of nature's gardener. It's a dung beetle that arrived with a boatload of cattle in the Boston Harbor in 1896 from Ireland, of all places. I don't know how they track that down, but it's the Photius fumitarius, probably the most abundant dung beetle today on the grasslands of North America. These guys can see that inorganic compound, pardon me, coming up off a dung pad, and they'll fly through an oxygen-rich environment, splat headfirst into that dung pad, which is anaerobic, and they hold their breath long enough to swim around, punch holes to the surface. If you're out in a cattle pasture and you'll see it dimpled with little holes, that's these guys oxygenating the inside of the dung pad so that they can then swim around. They don't eat dung, and they hunt the bacteria and protozoa that are living within that dung pad. Historically, across the Great Plains, before chemicals came into our lives, dung beetles and other insects would disperse a dung patch in a matter of 2 to 3 days sometimes, completely disappeared from the landscape. This is down in southern Alberta on a bison farm. 2 dung beetles rolling a brood ball. The females like these will create that ball, lay 1 egg in it, and then transport it away from the dung pat. Another female is wrestling her for it. It's a species called Canthon pilularis, and it's one of the biggest dung beetles in Canada. So to help people understand dung beetles and dung beetle ecology, I put this illustration together. Excuse me. So the dwellers are the little red guy, the Photius. She'll fly into that dung pat, create a chamber in it, then create a bunch of brood balls with 1 egg each in it, and then move off to the next dung pit. So she does everything within the dung pat. Then the rollers come along, that big black one you just saw, and they'll take a brood ball and roll it away from the dung pat into the vegetation or just into the soil surface. The dung beetles in Africa are the only species on the planet that use celestial navigation in their reproductive cycle. The female rollers will move their dung balls towards the full moon, or no full moon, it'll be they use the Milky Way to navigate in an effort to disperse their dung pat or their eggs away from the dung pat. And then the tunnelers, there's 2 types, fast and slow burying. And these are probably one of the most important on the Great Plains, or wherever they're found, because depending on the soil type, they'll create a tunnel down deep into the soil, upwards of 2 meters in some cases. And that creates an ideal place for water to infiltrate deep into the root systems. She's bringing nutrients in the form of bison manure down deep into the soil, amongst the root system of the grasses. Tremendously important for reproductive, for the plants themselves. They're fast burrowing, they do that pretty quickly, and then there's a slow burrowing guild that will lay multiple eggs in their chambers. So a pretty complex system, and then along comes a long-billed curlew, hunting the dung beetles, or McCown's longspur. Complex system. Here's a nice illustration showing how complex both the above ground and below ground ecosystems are. Tremendously important to have that complexity back on the landscape. As I mentioned, 1 manure pack can host up to 100 invertebrate species, over 1,000 individual insects. And there's one study done that shows that 1 bison cow can, just from her own dung, produce up to 1/4 of her body mass every year in insects. So I wondered what that was like when there were 30 million bison on the landscape. That's a lot of bugs. So I took William Hornaday's population decline graph. This is what he documented from 1861 to 89, how rapidly the bison population in North America plummeted through the slaughters. And then I used the 1/4 of a body mass of a bison cow to extrapolate back to insect mass. So this is actually the number of insects, 300 billion insects on a daily basis at the peak of the bison population, down to in 1889, virtually none. So you imagine the consequences, the implications that had for every insect-eating species on the landscape. It must have been desperate times for them. They do it in a bunch of different ways. Here's a nice young cow grazing. When we translocate bison into new homes, for conservation purposes, all the receiving agencies ask us to deliver the bison late in the winter, as close to spring as they can get to save costs of feeding. So the bison typically arrive in late winter, and this is the first thing they do when they're back out on the landscape, is create these grazing lawns, grazing patches. In this case, they're foraging craters where they don't use their feet like a horse or an elk would. They use their foreheads to sweep the snow away until they get down to the grass and eat what they've just uncovered. But in the spring, this is what that patch looks like. Intensely grazed right close to the soil surface, but it's surrounded by ungrazed vegetation. So that's called a grazing patch. Over time, as bison return to that patch, it'll become a grazing lawn, much bigger than a patch size. And it's like when we mow our lawns on Monday afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, you got to go back out there and cut it again. And that's what drove bison ecology for tens of thousands of years, is the constant regrowth through regrazing. This is that same patch in the middle and ungrazed on the outside. The big rutting aggregations that we hear about, there's one example from when they were surveying the Canada-US border. The survey crew was near Moose Jaw in southern Saskatchewan. They were trapped in their tents for 10 days. They'd even bring their horses into the tents while one herd of bison walked by. Massive summer breeding aggregations. For those number of animals to be supported, they had to regraze places that have been previously grazed, because that vegetation is instantly digestible, highly nutritious, and it grows back up again. So all summer long, they'll regraze all those little patches. But as soon as the grasses start to cure in August, that's the termination of the breeding season. And because the grasses can no longer produce that new growth, the grasses stop, they're cured, and that's what fragments those massive herds into smaller and smaller groups. And that's still happening in places like grasslands. Hello. Oh, there we go. Oh, finicky. So that's what the landscape looks like now. Before the bison arrived, this would be a monotone color, but each of the different variations is a different level of grazing and different species compositions. Incredibly complex now, much more heterogeneous than it was before the bison arrived. Some examples of the interspecies relationships. Here's two non-native ones. European starlings, of course, which were brought over as songbirds, and they're bedded in a stand of crested wheatgrass. Is anybody familiar with crested wheatgrass? A few people. Crested wheatgrass was brought into Canada from Siberia by the Canadian government in the 1930s to stabilize the drifting soils of the Dust Bowl era. It's an incredible plant for stabilizing drifting soils, puts down a dense root mass. And it's an adequate spring forage for cattle, but it's once it cures like this, it's got no nutrition in it, and it's incredibly invasive. Grasslands National Park purchased lands that had been planted to crested wheatgrass, and is costing millions of dollars now to convert that back into a native species mix, but two non-native species in one photograph. And to help people understand what happened when the park began to depopulate the place of cattle, it was still a very grass diverse landscape. Lots of different species, blue grama grass and needle grass, and diverse, and a very uniform, thin, fibrous root system. A lot of these prairie grasses will go down over 2 meters into the soil, but they're very fine, fibrous type roots. When we brought the bison back, it began to change, and we began to see an increase in the forbs. The one on the far left is winter fat, and it's called winter fat because cattle actually gain fat on it during the winter months. The grasses will cure at 8 to 10, 12% crude protein. Winter fat will carry 22% right through the winter. It's an incredibly important plant. And over time, we began to see a change, and a lot more taprooted plants, flowering plants, began to repopulate the landscape. Those seeds were still there. It just took grazing by bison to rejuvenate them and bring them back. So we began to see more complex landscape under the soil as well. And then the Nettles cottontail comes and forages on one of those grazing lawns. I mean, eventually this is the state they're now. This is an incredibly complex landscape, 13 land ground squirrels and butterflies and a whole host of species are returning to that landscape now that it's back into that diversity. This is what you can expect to see in grasslands now. And I mentioned the northern pocket gopher earlier. This guy's really important. Everybody hates them. People call them moles. They create these mole hills that on the soil surface, burrowing underground to do their foraging. They can't survive on grass roots. They have to have those tap roots of flowering plants. There's one study showed that it takes 3,500 times as much energy to travel 1 meter underground as it does 1 meter above ground. And they can't do that on grass roots. They have to have the fibers or the thick tuberous roots. Been a lot of work looking at the benefits of having the northern pocket gopher on the lands. This is just a very small list of species that benefit from the burrow systems. Yeah, I could easily triple or quadruple that list from the literature. So these guys are really important for the grassland ecosystem. And this is where I jumped ahead earlier about the snakes. This is a paper that was published a few years back. These biologists went into museums in the desert Southwest states looking for pickled snakes that had never been cut open. They wanted to know what the snakes were eating. So they went into museums and they found a bunch and they opened them up. And in doing that, they discovered that the snakes, well, on average, will hunt perhaps 10 or 12 mice per summer. And it all links back to bison. Here, a bison cow is grazing. We've got radio collars on bison, for example, in grasslands. And we found out that on average, a cow like this might move 10 kilometers, sometimes up to 20 in the course of a grazing day. So she'll be ingesting seeds here on one portion of the park. And by nightfall, she could be 10, 20 kilometers away. And when they bed down at the end of a foraging bout, they all lay down, chew their cud, give a big burp, and stand up, and of course, leave behind one of these. That dung pat is full of the seeds that she ingested throughout that 10-kilometer long walk that she did. Huge numbers of seeds contained in that dung pat. And then along comes the dung beetle and takes that away, and that brood ball contains the seeds that she'd eaten. So they'll take that brood ball buried in the soil in a rich growing medium, and up will pop all the plants that bison cow had eaten at some point. In this case, it's Indian rice grass, or it's kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rat and pocket mice have fur-lined cheek pouches, and they'll pack in there literally hundreds of seeds of Indian rice grass, or hundreds or dozens for sure, some of the bigger seeds. And if these guys hop on his way back home, he's a central food cache species. He'll fill his face with seeds, take it back, and create a winter food cache that he'll live on through the winter months. Well, if he gets snagged by a snake on the way home, the snake is also ingesting all of those seeds that mouse had in his mouth. So a snake can eat up to 10 to 12 pocket mice in the summer. They discovered that the rattlesnakes in particular don't have the ability to digest vegetative matter. They can only digest tissue, animal matter. So the seeds that pocket mice was carrying germinate inside the snake in the colon. And as the snake is slithering his way across the prairie, pooping out this long line of fully germinated seeds in an ideal growing medium, they're transporting the seeds that bison cow ate perhaps weeks or months before that. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating relationship. And of course, then other species like the pronghorn or deer will eat the plants that germinated from those seeds that the snake pooped out. Shed bison hair is a fascinating thing. It's the second warmest fiber in all of North America, next only to the muskox and the kiviot. Incredible fiber. My mom used to beg me to go and strip hair off dead bison, and she used to weave, knit me some wonderful mitts and toques and things out of dead buffalo hair. Really warm. And it sticks to everything that they brush up against. This is in Prince Albert National Park, a chickadee nest, and you can see the dark strands of bison hair on top. Underneath that is a dense mat of the underfur. There was a study done back in 1963 down at Manyberries in southern Alberta. They wanted to know the differences in hair coat density of bison. They're all yearling heifers, bison, yak, and Herefords. So some poor idiot had to count the number of hairs per square inch. And it turns out that a yearling heifer plains bison has upwards of 22,000 hairs per square inch. A yak had 14 and Herefords had 8,000. And bison are the only one that's shedded in clumps. They're called felts. They come off in large sheets and just land on the landscape like that. And then birds go along and find it. There was research done, and a lot of it in Oklahoma, looking at the tall grass prairie ecosystem and grassland songbirds there. And they found that a 60% increase in chick survival, egg and chick survival, when it was lined with bison hair. Because the bison hair has a strong smell, it hides the nest from passing predators like raccoons or whatever. It's incredibly water repellent. So in those nasty spring storms that they get, it keeps the nest dry. And it's, as I mentioned, incredibly warm. So up to a 60% increase in chick survival. And everywhere that they've been, countless papers have been published listing the sensitive species that benefit from bison hair. Johane was out in a part of the grasslands where the bison had only just recently colonized it. In particular, one old bull, he'd created a wallow and was thrashing and rolling and shedding his spring hair. And she saw this Richardson ground squirrel running back and forth from the wallow to her natal den. She's obviously nursing, and she's got pups down there. How did she know, 150 years after bison were last there, the value of that fiber to the survival of her pups? It just blows my mind. We saw the same thing when we reintroduced bison back into the backcountry in Banff. I was on that project, and the bison arrived there in February of 2017, and I was there from then through to the spring babysitting them. And in the spring, the Columbian ground squirrels came out. They'd gone to bed normal. They've always been going to bed like that. They woke up in the spring and suddenly there in their faces, a big shaggy animal. Within minutes, they were picking up the bison hair and taking it down into their natal dens. That ancestral knowledge, that intrinsic knowledge on these guys just blows my wee mind sometimes. Bison wallows are a pretty unique landscape feature. My wife and I like to visit bison wallows whenever we're in a system somewhere. We think of these as the guest book of Prairie Society. Everybody who visits there leaves their signatures in the dust for us to come along and read. In this one alone, we had 12 species of mammals, birds, and reptiles. An incredibly diverse number of species visit these things. This is in Prince Albert National Park. Black bear and a wolf in the same one. Coyotes, foxes, birds, insects. Tremendous variety of species will utilize dry wallows like that. They're important historically for thousands of years because an active bison wallow with no vegetation in it retains water in the spring, and they're referred to as vernal wetlands. And they're incredibly important. All through the background, you can see those lighter patches, little depressions. Those are ancient bison wallows that probably existed on that landscape for tens of thousands of years. But if they've grown back in, there's vegetation. And when there's vegetation, it won't hold water. The water is really important for these guys. Spade-footed toad and the Great Plains toad. The spade-footed toad in particular, their whole existence relies on these vernal wetlands. They have the fastest metamorphosis of any toad or frog, 10 days from egg laying to fully morphed adult. And when the eggs hatch and tadpoles form, the tadpoles have eyes that face sideways, a typical prey species skull morphology, and they'll feed on the pond algae and aquatic vegetation. But as the water depth in that wallow begins to drop as it dries up, it also increases in temperature. And it's the increase in temperature that causes the tadpole's skull to change and the eyes face forward. And they switch from being a herbivore to being a predator. And then they'll hunt other aquatic insects, smaller tadpoles. And then within 10 days, out they go and, as a fully morphed adult. So if you don't have those dry earthen wallows, you don't have that sequence of events. Again, when you think about it, how desperate it must have been once the bison were off that landscape. I was out one spring and it was a cold, miserable, sleety, rainy, snow, howling wind. Really quite a nasty day, on and off sun. And I saw these two pronghorn does bedded on the side of a slope. So I stopped to take a couple lousy pictures and realized that the one up top there had just given birth to twins. There we go. So I sat and watched for a few minutes, probably 20 minutes from the time I first saw them until those little guys got to their feet and Mom led them around the corner and out of my sight. So I walked over to where she'd just given birth, avoiding the placenta and the amniotic fluid. I laid down where those two fawns were just born. There wasn't a breath of wind, perfectly calm. She herself was probably born in an ancient bison wallow. It was only about 30 centimeters deep, but the wind flowed right over top of it. Really quite neat. Prairie dogs, bison, they have a long history together. Prairie dogs are a species that live in a shortgrass environment, and they maintain it as a shortgrass. They totally clip that landscape really as close as they can get it. Ranchers despise them because they think that there's no food left there for their cattle. But there's actually been some work showing that cattle will gain weight on a prairie dog town because what's growing there is so succulent and digestible. It's deceptive. Prairie dogs have a difficult time expanding the size of their colonies because to walk into that tall grass around the outside is to be exposed to predation. And there's lots of predators waiting for an unwary prairie dog. The prairie dogs are out in North America about 4 million years ago. Plains bison, as I mentioned. There's some new research says that that's been pushed back to about 160,000 years ago. And then ferrets arrived about that time frame. So complex ecosystem functioning within each of those prairie dog towns. There's a prairie dog town in the historical literature in Wyoming that was 150 miles long and 100 miles wide. Literally billions of prairie dogs in there. The U.S. Geological Survey was hired to go in there and trap those colonies out. They used poison and shooting and literally decimated those big colonies. They even have photographs of on a hillside like that in the background. You see people will spell their names in white rocks on slopes. Well, they spelled the USGS in dead prairie dogs that you could see from 20 miles away. Really quite disgusting. So when you have two keystone species like the prairie dog and the bison on the landscape, they begin to have some pretty significant impacts on everything else that lives there, including burrowing owls. Burrowing owls will nest here in grasslands. They'll fly all the way down into central Mexico or even further south into South America. And then in the spring, the males, the larger one, they come back first. And they'll search around for a prairie dog town like this and find a burrow system that they think is unoccupied. Then they go back across the prairie picking up dried buffalo chips, and they bring it back and they decorate the surface of that burrow system and make it look as attractive as possible to the arriving females that come along later. She'll fly along, look down there, oh, that guy's a pretty good provider. I'll shack up with him for the summer. And then once the female's begun to nest, he continues that. He'll bring buffalo chips down into the full length of the burrow system and down into the nesting chamber. And it turns out that dried buffalo droppings in the nesting chamber and in the tunnel act as a relative humidity control system. It means a constant relative humidity of 66 degrees, perfect for rearing eggs and chicks underground. And then once the chicks have hatched, that dung provides a source of food for nearby beetles to forage on. So the beetles will follow that down into the tunnel system, and the chicks can learn to hunt the beetles in the security of their natal tunnel. Really quite a remarkable system. This is a mountain plover. She's standing on a dried buffalo chip. Highly endangered species in Canada for sure. And of course, the bison disappeared from the landscape, so too did their dung. I was out in grasslands and had the fortunate opportunity to almost soil my man panties when one of them flushed out from underneath my feet. I had no idea she was there until she just exploded out. Get the crap out of me. So that's what a mountain plover nest looks like. Virtually invisible out on the Great Plains. And of course, sharp-tailed grouse and sage grouse both require short grass environments or short places like this to do their spring dances. Back in the 80s, early 70s through to the early 80s, they used to do sage grouse surveys. These guys in the park, and they always counted males. Almost every organization that counts or monitors sage grouse counts the males because they're big and glorious and they're a good reflection of how well the population's doing. And in grasslands, they'd routinely count 200 males on a lek. There's 12 this year. The population's crashed that much. And my personal theory is if you look at all the population decline graphs for grassland songbirds, it all starts at about 1970. And from that point down, every species in a state of population decline. That's the same year that ivermectin was introduced to the livestock industry as a dewormer. Ivermectin was developed as a human deworming agent. Merck Veterinary contributes up to 3 million doses a year to third world countries to control human parasite loads. And cattlemen across the planet realized that if this is doing such a wonderful job for people, maybe it will work in our livestock industry. And by 1970, it was rampant right across the continent and later worldwide. And you can time the introduction of ivermectin into the livestock industry to the crash in grassland songbirds. Because for 3 months after that drug is injected into the animal, and it poops it out onto the landscape, for 3 months it continues to kill insects, and in particular beetles, which is the primary forage for these species. So we decimated the food supply for sage-grouse in particular. This is a neat relationship. We know of at least 3 coyote-badger pairs hunting cooperatively in the park, and it's been reported in the literature wherever there's prairie dogs. And it's a pretty neat system. There's 2 types of mounds on a prairie dog colony. They're called a domed mound, a very shallow sloping mound, and then a rimmed mound, almost like a miniature volcano. And as the wind flows across the prairie, it goes down the domed one and comes out the rimmed mound, creating a constant fresh air system in there. And I always think of this as like walking past the exhaust of a bakery. Damn, I'd like to go in there and eat, coming out of that domed mound. And these guys think the same thing. They can smell those prairie dogs underground as that fresh air is coming up. So in many cases, the coyote will, and on one occasion we saw 3 of them, hot August day, it was 40 degrees out, and they're comatose. They're just flat out in the middle of a prairie dog town. And hundreds of prairie dogs are up on their hind legs barking at them. Everybody's on alert, saying there's 3 prairie dogs or 3 gophers over there, they'll get you. Meanwhile, sneaking up from behind was the badger, casually picking off the ones that weren't paying attention. And then they reverse roles, and the badger would sit quietly somewhere, and a coyote would come by and do the same thing. Or the badger would dig into a burrow system and pop a prairie dog right up into the jaws of a waiting coyote. Really quite neat to see 2 apex predators hunting cooperatively. This is in Elk Island. Elk Island, I would assume many people have been to Elk Island. This is a pretty typical scene at this time of year. The grazed slopes are greening up. It's a mix of wetlands, ponds, and aspen forests. And typically the bison will graze those greening slopes, move back to the forest edge like this guy's done, chew their cud, and then of course, like they do everywhere, leave behind a paddy. I was in the park one day, midsummer, and I saw this young woman crawling around on her hands and knees in a meadow system, nose about that far from the ground and moving very, very slow. And what is she up to? I watched for a few minutes and I couldn't stand it. I had to go over and ask her what she was doing. Turns out she was a PhD student from Finland doing research on the slave-making behavior of one ant species on another. And to do that, she'd find say a red anthill, whatever species, and she'd follow that ant as it left the home colony. They'd go across and find a black anthill and snag a black ant, bring it back and turn it into a slave to serve the red ant colony. And in doing that, she discovered that virtually every anthill in the park is founded on a bison paddy like this, because the queen ants need that nutrient base to form their new colony. And because bison forage on the open slopes, but then move back to the forest edge to lay down and chew their cud and defecate, there's a higher density of anthills adjacent to the forest edge than there is out in the open. And that's important for these guys, the northern flicker. These guys are primarily an anteater in that landscape. They nest in the forest edge, but they'll hop out and walk around the ground picking up ants and other insects. And they create a nesting cavity that's kind of intermediate in size. And that's really important for these guys, the northern flying squirrel. Turns out all other woodpeckers, downies and hares and pileated, all the nesting cavities are either too big or too small. But the flicker cavity is the Goldilocks of cavities for these guys. It's just perfect. But these guys are fussy about how they use those cavities. They have some that are used just for refugia, a place to go to shelter, if there's a goshawk around or something. They have others where they go just to rear their young, and they have others that they use just for their toilet cavities. And that's really important for this guy. Little wee tiny dung beetle, not much bigger than 4 millimeters, 4 to 11, I think it says. It's the only place on the planet where you'll find it. Insignificant to you and I. I'll never see one. But without bison on the landscape and that sequence of events, these guys wouldn't exist here. Then I look at this painting that's hanging in the museum in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, painted by Frederick Vernier in 1893, showing the last buffalo. And that's how I always envisioned the Great Plains after the extermination was done. The carcasses here and there, but not much else. Really depressing landscape. The Keystone Species was gone. And that led to this study. These guys, Dorchester now, came up with this analogy that a DC, I forget what kind of aircraft this is, it comes up, flying through the air and there's an idiot in there. And he's crawling around the darkest corners of that airplane, pulling parts out of it. That's the parts list for a DC or C-46 airplane. So he can continue to pull those parts out of there and nothing happens. But then eventually he pulls a keystone part out and splat. This is a C-46 just outside of the airport in Churchill, Manitoba, locally known as Miss Piggy. She crashed not because some idiot pulled a part out, but because they overloaded her. And the same thing happens in ecosystems. We can either remove a keystone species or we can dump so much on the ecosystem that the ecosystem collapses. But it turns out that if you put back that keystone species, I don't think you could do this with Miss Piggy, but if you put back the keystone species on the landscape, all the other bits and pieces that functioned on that system will return on their own over time. And that's what we're seeing in grasslands now, and virtually every other place. And this is just a tiny list. So you think back to this complex map and the fact that this whole presentation was based on that little tiny dot in the Cypress Hills and the Grasslands National Park. How complex North America once was when there were 46 ecosystems with bison living in them. And ecosystems incredibly diverse from one another. It must have been an incredibly complex landscape. So perhaps the most important message of all this is that every new bison population that we can get started benefits pretty much everything else out there. I give this presentation a lot to ranching groups, both cattle and bison ranchers. And I don't know how many times I've had a rancher say, well, I've only got 80 acres and I've got 6 bison on it. Can I possibly contribute in some small way? And I say, yeah, you bet. You think of the birds that are flying from South America to the Arctic. They need to refuel, and those stopover points are places where they land, forage, gain a little bit of weight, and go back on to the next one, and hopscotch their way north. It doesn't matter whether you've got 3,000 head of bison or 10. You can contribute to supporting that bird on its annual migration north and south. And it's incredibly important to me to have bison back on the landscape and to sell books. So I'll entertain lots of questions. I like questions. Don't be shy. Monica.
Oh, we'll get used to speaking to the microphone so the people online.
Yeah, I was just curious if there's been any research. You were talking about the importance of the bison dung. Has there been any research comparing that to domestic cattle? Like, does domestic cattle dung provide the same value?
It can. And from the extirpation of plain bison across North America in the 1890s, up to the 1890s, very shortly after that, cattle became a surrogate for bison, especially as Texas longhorns moved north from Texas through the central Great Plains and up into southern Canada. They replicated the behavior of bison. Their dung was healthy. Those insect populations that had crashed came back again because they had healthy cattle dung to live on. That changed because of two things. The winter of 1896-97, I think it was 1896, was a nasty winter across the northern Great Plains and wiped out. At that time, it was the cattle barren era. No fences, cattle could graze wherever they wanted, and tens of thousands of cattle moved north. The winter of 1896-97 wiped them out. Literally, all those cattle died from that Owen storm, forcing the small producers out and the big ranchers to get bigger. The big ranchers did really good again after that until the winter of 1905-06, when a worse storm came along and completely wiped them out. So that ended the era of free-range grazing in North America, and it caused a switch from producers leaving their cattle out on land all winter long to bring them home and feeding them in yards and feedlots, which is the story today. So that ended the time period where there was fresh dung on the landscape in the spring for all those insects to reproduce and live on. They didn't arrive, cattle didn't go back out on grass until usually May sometime. So that critical period in the spring when diapause for insects ends was tough for them. And then with the introduction of ivermectin in the cattle industry, they're no longer a surrogate for bison. There are some places like the McIntyre Ranch in southern Alberta. They have 10,000 head of cattle that free range all winter long, and they're serving as surrogates for bison. Hope that answered your question.
We have a question in the back.
My question is, I'm doing a research report in school about North American plains bison. Are there any cool fun facts about them?
Any cool fun facts?
Yeah.
Let's see. They're the biggest animal in North America.
I could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick question. In the park system, do you ever have issues with the bison and equestrians, like if people are riding horses?
Grasslands is open to equestrian use and there's never been an issue. Elk Island National Park unofficially doesn't allow horse use, but there's no regulations against it. The park owned 6 horses while I worked there, and I'd ride 1,000 kilometers in the summer, and I never had an issue with the bison. Yellowstone and horses interact all the time. There's always, I refer to them as idiots and Turons, the people who do stupid things with bison, and they'll certainly cause some problems with people who are inexperienced. Custer State Park in South Dakota every September conducts a huge roundup. I just think I read the stat the other day, they had 250,000 people lining one valley as park staff would haze bison down through the corral systems. I rode on one of that a few years back, and they had a Stars Air ambulance and 2 ground ambulances sitting waiting, and they were all gone within the first few minutes with equestrians. Horses need to be exposed to bison to do well. Banff National Park wanted to use horses to both monitor and to sometimes live dart and tranquilize the bison. So we put a herd of bison on the Ahatinda Horse Ranch where Parks Canada raises their horses. And the bison and the horses coexisted in the pasture system. So when they went out on the open range in the park, there were no issues. But bison and horses can not mix very well. Yeah, it's important to practice.
My question will be an easy one for you. I have to confess my ignorance about the word obligate.
Obligate means they don't have a choice. They're obligated to stay where they are. In the case of grassland birds, for example.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Are there any bison? Oh, there's one bison producer in the audience. Are there more than one? No.
I'm sorry. The white buffalo, how often does that happen?
The true white buffalo of native legend, very rarely, like in the millions. You might have one per, nobody really knows, but literally in the millions. In the industry today, with the bison ranching industry, there's a lot of hybridization between bison and Simmentals or Charolais to create a white bison. And that's if you're on a farm or somewhere and you see more than one, if you see one, very likely it's a cattle bison hybrid, not a white bison.
So my question, sort of as follow-up on the previous one, comes from the days when I was a little younger and I used to take my university outdoor students out to camp, winter camp in Elk Island. And one of the great treats for me was getting on cross-country skis early in the morning and skiing around. And I think we went right through the bison, and it was marvelous to see them, you know, there with the ice fog all around them. Marvelous experience, kind of mystical, but they never paid any attention to us. Have you ever had a problem in Elk Island with people or bison bothering skiers or anyone else?
Well, they live behind a wonderful clister. If you got sloppy conditions, bison poop on the trail really gives your ski a kick. You know, I researched in national parks when there's any kind of negative encounter, or it doesn't matter what it is, a form called the occurrence report was filled out. And I researched the occurrence reports going back to about 1915 was when they started, all the way through to the time when I left the park in 2008. And there was never a person killed by bison. There were, I think, 6 physical contacts where injury occurred to the person. And most of those were self-inflicted. Trying to walk between me and this podium, in one case, there was a cut bank on one side of the road and a drop off to a lake on the other, and the bulls grazing there. And 2 local cattle producers tried to walk between the bull and the cut bank. He spent a fair length of time in the hospital. But very, very rare. They're incredibly respectful and patient with people. Yeah, as I said, nobody's ever been killed. Unlike Yellowstone, where on average at least 1 a year.
I have kind of a 2-part question. You said you were involved with the 2017 Banff reintroduction. I guess first I was wondering what kind of observation time frame would you wait before you consider that a success? And secondly, is there any other areas of Alberta or Canada that have been identified for potential reintroduction?
Yeah, sure. Just to a few steps from that question. 1981, I joined the Warden Service in Banff, and 2 other wardens and I went on a fall hunting boundary patrol, and we ended up in the Red River Valley, crested this mountain pass, and we stopped, and our horses were, and we were looking down in the Panther River Valley. And coincidentally, our horses' feet were standing in ancient bison wallows, and we looked at each other and speculated, would the day ever come when bison might be back here, and just scoffed, and yeah, that would never happen. In 2017, it did. We took 16 bison there, and they're now up to about 160 head and doing very well. The province was very reluctant to cooperate or they just simply didn't want it to happen because they don't want bison out on provincial lands. So the park developed an agreement with the province that it was a 5-year trial program. If there were no major wrecks after a 5-year period, and major wrecks meaning the whole herd left the park and caused all kinds of damage, that they'd shut it down and remove the bison and never consider it again. It's been a success. The 5-year period has gone over a year ago now. And there's been a couple excursions out of the park, mostly by young bulls, which is what young bulls do. They're the dispersers, the colonizers. 3 young bulls out of the 6 that were taken there left the park. One of them ended up on the Blood Indian Reserve in southern Alberta and tranquilized and hauled them down there. And the other 2 were shot. One, they salvaged the meat. The other was in such a remote area that they couldn't get at it, so it was just left on the landscape. And along the east boundary of the park, bordering the forest reserve, they've implemented a series of fences wherever there's a creek or drainage leaving the park. And it's a wildlife-friendly structure so that all the other wildlife species can move through, but bison don't. And that's worked very well. And then they've also implemented a bison stewards program where volunteers, horse equestrian groups can go back there and search the landscape when they're riding and report any sightings of bison. So yeah, it's been a very successful program. The province is in negotiation now with Banff to establish a zone outside the park where those plains bison would receive wildlife status. Currently, only the Zama Lake wood bison herd in northwestern Alberta has wildlife status. The populations that are outside of Wood Buffalo National Park have no status. They're considered a non-entity on the part of the province, with the exception of a couple herds like Ronald Lake and Athabasca. But to answer your question, project is a success. They've implemented a First Nations hunting season, or hunting program, not a season, where First Nations can apply to go in there and harvest the bison as a way of maintaining, stopping exponential population growth, because it'll very rapidly expand if they don't control it. So last fall, 3 bison were harvested by tribes from southern Alberta. And it's a success, so they'll probably continue that program. And if they do move out into the province as wildlife, then the province will implement a hunting season on them.
I was just saying, I think by Fort Mac and Wood Buffalo, they've issued a few tags this year too for Indigenous groups.
Yeah. Outside of Wood Buffalo National Park, Wood Buffalo National Park has both diseases, bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis. And there's a way to stop any contact with cattle, there's a no-go zone for all those bison around wood buffalo. Anyone that steps out there is free game. Anybody can hunt it at any time of the year as a way to stop the disease spread. But having said that, there's never been a case of bison giving a disease to a cow. It's always the other way around. Yellowstone National Park has brucellosis, and they have a massive slaughter every year. This spring they shot 1,500 when they leave the north end of the park, because the ranchers are concerned that their cattle are going to be infected with brucellosis. It's never happened. Any disease issues that happen down there are caused by elk, which also carry brucellosis. But because they're a sport animal, nobody complains about them. But they would be the ones that spread disease to cattle, not the bison.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a crazy question.
I like crazy
Typical,
questions.
Yeah. And this is sort of under the assumption that we as human two-legged can't really deal with our ecological problems, climate and so on. And so we screw it all up. And given the state of the restoration and rewilding that you and other colleagues around the world have done, could the bison go free and create a whole new bison commons like in the beginning?
Certainly, wood bison certainly can, because wood bison live in a place that's sparsely occupied by people and no agriculture typically. For plains bison, it's a different story. There's just no vacant landscape left that's suitable for plains bison, other than on First Nations lands. And there's a huge upswelling and interest on tribal lands in the US and First Nations in Canada to bring bison back onto their lands. And that's the hope in the future now, is to get more bison back onto their lands. There is a movement underway to establish a transboundary plains bison herd that would move freely from Montana up the Eastern Rockies, past Glacier National Park and into Waterton. Free to move north and south, however, women dictated. They're fencing Highway 5 on the Blood Indian, or the Blackfeet Indian Reserve in Montana, to confine the bison to the west and into Glacier. So that one's coming on stream fairly rapidly. And that'll be the largest free-ranging plains bison population in Canada for sure. Wood bison, they're doing well. There's 13 populations of wood bison now across northern Alberta, BC, Yukon, into Alaska now, and they're all doing very well. Well, if that's it, oh, one more.
I have a question that an English colleague once asked me, and you might find it useful in your talks. He asked, what's the difference between a buffalo and a bison?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, technically there are no true buffalo in North America. They're the Cape buffalo or the Asian water buffalo. But when Europeans began to bump into them, the only thing that they had any familiarity with was the European or the buffalo of Asia and Africa. So they called them buffalo. It's also an anglicized version of le boeuf, the French term for bison. It eventually became the buffalo and then the buffalo. So it's a colloquial term, it's a traditional term, and I frequently switch back and forth. Obviously, I named the book after buffalo, and there's right very soon inside the cover, I explain why I did that. And we've received some grief because of the title. Rocky Mountain National Park in Manitoba has a small display herd of bison. And I got a call from their head interpreter chastising me for titling the book Ecological Buffalo and not Ecological Bison, because they spend so much of their time trying to convince the public that, no, they're not buffalo, they're bison. And why would I do that? But to me, the cultural, the history, the traditional term still carries considerable weight.
So considering that this was an English prof, his best answer was that you can't wash your face in a buffalo.
Exactly, but you can in a bison.
Any last questions?
My question is of the audience as well as Wes and Johane. When we first talked to Wes and Johane, we talked about some school presentations, and they have a variety of presentations. The one that could be particularly interesting, I think, is how they rounded up and flew and trucked bison all over the world, particularly Siberia. And I'm wondering if you can't commit yourself now, but would there be sufficient interest to have Wes and Johane back another time to talk about some of the other, it's only scratched the surface of the things that they do and know. But anyway, would there be interest in, for example, finding out how they rewilded bison in Siberia? That's a yes, I guess. I didn't see any of these, but
Yeah.
but
It's a talk called Flying Buffalo, and it presents the behind the scenes technical difficulties of translocating bison in the belly of aircraft. First into Siberia, and I took 30 head over there in the belly of a Russian cargo plane, and then into the central part of Alaska. We flew some in there in the belly of a Hercules airplane, and then most recently the Banff one, where we flew them in with helicopters. And so it's behind the scenes logistic hassles of doing that, the challenges. So I'll leave it at that. I'll meet you over here, and if you have more questions, if you're too shy to ask, just come on over and
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wes, on behalf of Science Outreach Athabasca and Crooked Creek. I will do the door prizes here and help yourselves to